Hello, my name is William Wexler, and I'm here to welcome you to the Atlantic Council. For those of you who are here in person, for those of you who are watching online, we very much appreciate your attention to this incredibly important subject that we're here to discuss today. I lead the work on the Middle East and North Africa at the Atlantic Council, and as you can imagine, I and everyone on my team, and indeed everyone across the Atlantic Council, has been very busy for the last number of days. If you haven't had a chance already, I really encourage everyone to go to our website and see the vast amount of very high quality essays, videos, information that are being produced at scale. Questions about what is happening right now, immediate reactions, questions about what's happening in the region, questions about how the rest of the world is addressing these issues, predictions for what to come, asking the questions and then giving answers about what to expect in the future. We're here to discuss one of the things that will drive a lot of that discussion, which is what this means for our wider security posture across the region and across the world. Answering that question is not an easy one, because in order to answer that question, you have to ask yourselves, what's the impact on the war as we've seen it at this moment? What is the impact for how this war might develop in the days and weeks to come? What is the impact depending on how this war ends? Depending on how you answer any one of those questions will vastly change how this might affect our wider security posture. As far as myself, see two big inflection points, as we like to say here at the Atlantic Council. One is a military math question. How successful is the United States and Israel at taking out the launchers? And how does that compare to the effectiveness that Iran is having of depleting the arsenal of interceptors that we see around the region? That is going to have not just a tactical and operational military affect the outcome, but it's going to affect a political outcome in terms of the pressures on the United States in order to end the war. That's the Iranian objective. And the second inflection point, we're not even yet at. What does the Iranian people do? On Saturday at 2 a.m., President Trump called explicitly on the Iranian people to stay in their homes and stay safe right now, but the moment that this war is over, the moment that the safety out, that they are to rise up and take their country back. He said this is their best chance that they've had in 47 years to do this. Those comments were very similar to the comments he made in January, where he encouraged the Iranian public to rise up. And he said help is on the way at the time. Unfortunately, help was not on the way. Our posture did not allow us to have the help on the way, because the assets that are typically in the region, at least I'm old enough to remember when they were typically in the region, were not. We had no aircraft carrier strike group in and around the Persian Gulf, which not too long ago was unimaginable, but frankly more recently has become more regular. But we also had no aircraft carrier strike group in the Mediterranean. And I'm having a hard time remembering a moment when we had neither of those two assets. Why didn't we? Because they were off the coast of Venezuela, following the strategy that was laid out in our national security strategy and our national defense strategy about where the priorities were. So we had no assets to be able to back up President Trump's words. And as a result, just like in Hungary in 1956 or in Iraq in 1991, a president of the United States publicly called on people to come up, and they were brutally massacred. What happens if the Iranian public again follow President Trump's call, rise up, and we have all of our forces right online? I don't know the answer to that. I can imagine, but I know that will be a very difficult decision for President Trump. So I encourage everyone here to think about these different scenarios as they're having their very impressive conversation that we expect. We have here Jen Gavito, who's going to come on screen, who is a non-resident senior fellow of our Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran. We have Joe Costa, the Director of the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense Program, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Plans and Posture. We have Andrew Peak, the Director of the Adrian Arch National Security Resilience Initiative and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran in the first Trump administration. We have Asha George, the Director of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and Marcos Garlauskas, the Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative and a former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tressa, the Scowcroft Center's Director for Programs and Operations, who will be moderating today's discussion. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Will. We really appreciate that overview. And it is a perfect setting to jump right in. And Jen, I'm going to go with you first. Thanks for joining us online. We really appreciate it. A couple of big questions, and we are in early stages right now, but what are you thinking about paths of escalation and de-escalation? And then also, I think this has come into more focus just in the last day or two, is just what do you see as the differences and similarities between U.S. and Israeli objectives in this conflict so far?
Sure, and thanks, Will, and thanks, Tressa, for doing this, and apologies for having to be online today. So to your first question about, kind of avenues to escalation or de-escalation, I think we are still 4 or 5 days into this war, pretty uncertain what the overall objectives are. That seems to be a moving target. And we've heard everything from nuclear degradation to degradation of Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders, to, of course, regime change. And while there is a sense, I think, over the last 24 hours that maybe the administration is coalescing around that middle option of degrading its ability to spread terror beyond its borders, at the same time, overnight, we've heard about plans to potentially arm Kurdish factions, Kurdish parties in Iraq's Kurdistan region as a way to arm Kurdish groups inside of Iran and perhaps start the process of fomenting unrest there. And so that points more, to my mind, to continue dabbling in the idea of regime change. All to say that until we know definitively what the objective is and how you would define what success of that objective looks like, it is very difficult to imagine what the off-ramps look like. Certainly, we are far, far, far away from a regime change objective that I think could drag us into conflict for months, if not years. On the other hand, if you're content with further destruction of the nuclear program, then that's a much shorter timeline. Just to finish that thought by saying, I think that domestic pressures will probably have a lot to do with that. We've already lost 6 servicemen. Prices are going up. Transit is getting disrupted. And so it will be interesting to see what kind of staying power the administration has against those pressures. Just very quickly on the divergence of Israeli and U.S. objectives. This is a fight that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been wanting to undertake with the United States for more than 20 years. His objective, I believe, is clearly regime change, destruction of this regime. For the United States, I think that left to its own devices, the objectives would be somewhat more narrow than that, among other things, because we don't relish the same kind of extended conflict that the Israeli government may be willing to endure. So I think, in my mind, that is the major divergence, and figuring out, again, how to merge those objectives in an operation that up until this point has been a joint one, I think will be one of the challenges moving forward.
And Jen, before we turn to Joe, I'd love to get your thoughts on just kind of the policymaking process of this. It's been different than past conflicts. So I'd love your insights there.
It has been different, and I do have concerns about it. I think one of somebody asked me today why the messaging was so scattered, and I think that that's what happens when you don't have a rigorous policymaking process that goes through a strong National Security Council that involves the voices of all the agencies and that draws in the kinds of expertise that exist at the State Department, at the Department of Energy, and elsewhere in the government. Certainly for the State Department, we know that has been largely hollowed out, particularly at the senior levels over the last year. And so a lot of the expertise has been lost. And even where it still exists, you're looking at a negotiating process that, for the most part, with some exceptions, there were some rounds that included a couple of subject matter experts, but really came down to two individuals that did not have deep expertise in this area. And so without the ability to hear dissenting views, without the possibility of pressure testing some of your assumptions, you can find yourself going down a course that could have been better avoided. And I think that what we're seeing right now is an unwinding of this process and an unfolding of it that perhaps is unfolding in ways that weren't entirely predicted by the administration, that could have been better understood if that rigorous policymaking process and if those experts have been brought into the discussion.
Thank you. So Joe, let's put on your former DASD hat. I wanted you to give us some insights on, the trade-offs in terms of the strategic trade-offs globally of this conflict, and then if you could segue into readiness, which is such an important topic but does not get enough attention. Will just mentioned munitions, but there are other aspects of readiness that are being affected by this conflict. Love your views there.
Thanks, Tressa. So I think when we think of these kinds of military operations in the headlines, what most people see is, oh, there's an aircraft carrier, there's a lot of fighter jets out there. It looks, in some cases, like the Maduro operation. It's short, it's sweet, it's quick, we're done with it, mission accomplished. And that sounds good in theory. It's not how it works in practice. There are enormous readiness impacts when we launch an operation at this scale, when we also put it in combination with ongoing assets that are in the Caribbean. We just launched military strikes in Ecuador. This is happening all over the place. So what are things that those in uniform have to actually deal with when they're working with the Joint Staff? One, known realities. Inventory is being depleted significantly, not only in terms of munitions, but also in terms of wear and tear on our hard assets. Second, you're going to have maintenance backlogs. Those are effects that we're going to see not just 6 months from today, but potentially years from today, because you're going to be bringing back aircraft and ships right now that were taken out of their maintenance cycles that now have to go back in. So you have this enormous backlog. In some cases, we have to send material that simply is not quite ready to fight, but needs to get out there. Third, deploy to dwell, D2D. This is when our brave soldiers are told, you actually don't get to rest. You actually have to keep going out. You have to keep fighting. We have found through significant studies, morale goes down. It hurts unit cohesion, a series of other second-order effects that we learned both in Iraq and Afghanistan with the Houthi operations that occurred in the last administration, et cetera. Fourth, delayed training. You have delayed training that some people taken out of their training cycles. Finally, you have cannibalization of units. In op tempo that is this intense, we are breaking apart units that train together. We're taking equipment from different units. We're changing people from different units. The cumulative impact of all of these things together, which are absolutely impossible to measure in real time, and even in some cases, years after we've done stuff from this, we're still trying to understand what the impacts of them are, actually play out in real time when we think about, are we ready for China and homeland defense? So the so what here is we have lost Tactical advantage vis-a-vis China, unquestionably, because our readiness has been so degraded by this operation already 4 days in. If we go 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, we'll see more of this sort of building. Second, we've degraded readiness for our homeland defense mission in a worst case scenario. And I want to emphasize in a worst case scenario, but these sorts of air defense assets and others we might need back here on the home front. That's number one, and number two priority in the NDS and in the national security strategy. Two other things I will emphasize here: cost. Very difficult to assess it at this stage. Reports are we've already spent over $1 billion. Rough estimates, if we go 2 months, you're talking $65 billion. The price tag goes up from there. These are open source, rough estimates. Venezuela already, Bloomberg said $3 billion. So we'll figure out total costs here. Massive amount of money that'll be going towards this that won't be going to other things. If we think of AI, if we think of other aspects that are top priorities for it, this is gonna take first priority. Finally, I would say allies and partners, another cost here is this isn't the coalition of the willing. We're seeing with our European allies and partners where they, if we look back to the Iraq war, they were part of our offensive operations. Right now, they're playing tactically defensive operations. You're seeing some support, but you're also seeing a lot of words coming out saying, we didn't support this. We have to see how that is going to impact us going forward in towards of access basing overflight, sustainment, logistics, not just in this conflict, but going forward in other regions, how allies and partners might look at this and rethink their relationship with the US on this front.
Thank you, Joe. That was very comprehensive. And you mentioned AI, but that, from a readiness perspective from the US side, but how have you seen it unfold in the conflict so far? There have been data centers hit in the Gulf. And then from an application perspective, what do we know so far?
So open source reporting, it actually just came out today, was that Claude is being used. I think we all need to figure out in what way or capacity here. It's ironic in some cases, but I think that we are seeing a bunch of new technologies be used. We're seeing reports of Israel using laser systems. I think we'll figure out once the fog of war is over exactly how this is playing out. But 2 points I think is interesting here. First is we are revealing our tactics to our adversaries. So China and Russia are watching this extremely closely, as in others, and they're seeing our force employment and the type of technologies we're using and how. Second, specifically to the AI point, our adversaries and our allies are going to be studying how we're using it here. Data centers were just hit in the UAE. And yes, to what is in the headlines on the Anthropic conversation, I think this is going to spark a lot of questions on our reliance on Claude right now and what it means as we think of that larger conversation with DOW.
Yeah, lots more to come there. Thank you. Andrew, I want to turn to you. Let's just talk kind of big picture stuff first. Walk us through what the strikes mean for Trump's broader foreign policy agenda and objectives, and where are they consistent and where are they kind of working at odds with each other right now?
I think the president's always had this, his foreign policy has always been this amalgam of sharp, decisive shows of force and use of force and a basic political ethos that came out of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. His kind of defining political moment where he moved from 5% to 30% in the Republican primary in 2015 was at a debate where alone out of all the other, whatever we were at, 35 or so Republican political candidates, he was the only one to criticize the Iraq war when people were talking in general about the US being overinvested in the Middle East, right? And that at a moment that was at Trump at his best, right? Almost the like Martin Luther of the American foreign policy establishment, kicking in these hollowed shibboleths and sort of exposing that the emperor has no clothes. So it is not out of character for him to take these sort of actions that you would not expect if you only listened to one side of the political spectrum, the isolationists or the restrainers or whoever. I do think for the president, there is this the war is either a short-term option or it's a long-term option, right? Those are the kind of two successful wars you have. You can walk away in 3 days and this is a win. You're like, we blew up the missiles, we worked over the remnants of the nuclear infrastructure, we worked over the proxies and helped the Israelis hit the proxies in Lebanon and sort of some of the IRGC networks, the Quds Force networks that coordinate with the proxies. Come back when you're ready to deal and you've elected a new leader and he's stayed alive for more than 20 minutes. Once there's an opposition on the ground, then you really have to see it through. You have to, because if you have an opposition, the Kurds take Tabriz, where there's a Kurdish majority, and then there's like kind of an independent political movement and a threat to regime. The regime sends security forces. You have to help protect them at that point, because if they get massacred, then that's a disaster. And when I first started in this business on the Hill, my first big policy job working in a now defeated Senate office, my boss said to me, Andrew, I want to be very frank with you, nobody cares about foreign policy. And I said, that's not true, sir, I care about foreign policy. And he said, Americans don't vote on foreign policy, they just don't like disasters. And I think that's very true. So I think there's a short-term win, and then there's a long-term win of the overthrow of the regime, but there's not like that middle-term win where something sort of happens with the regime, and then we like walk away.
Thank you. That's a great set of insights there. I wanted to turn to your background as well, on Russia and Europe. Let's talk about what Moscow is thinking right now. Tehran calling and nobody picking up in Moscow over the past few days. What does this mean for kind of the geostrategic calculus for Russia and the Middle East and vis-a-vis Tehran?
Yeah, it's so interesting because of course, politically, prestige-wise, it's a huge hit for the Russians, right? Just like Venezuela was, but almost more. One of the foundational myths or foundational moments of modern Russian power, in addition to Georgia, in addition to Ukraine I, was the decisive intervention in Syria in 2015, and particularly in the region, this sort of short, sharp show of force in contrast to their words and others' words, the kind of plotting, unfocused American approach to projecting power in the region really made, and the help with Assad strengthening his government at the time temporarily, made Russia look like the effective, brutal, sharp, tough power and the best ally to have. And I think that was tremendously helpful for them over the next 5 years, 8 years, and kind of being an attractive, hard power leading to soft power. People wanted the Russians to be on their side. That has obviously collapsed at the moment. So there has certainly been a political effect in terms of Russia's attractiveness as an ally. It sort of materially, it hasn't changed the Ukraine piece very much. The Russians did just shift their position about 2 days ago and indicated that they would accept a Western exclusive security guarantee of some kind for Ukraine. That was kind of what they were hinting at, which would have been significantly different than what they were demanding at Istanbul in 2022. Like that was a big shift for them. Now, it's not a shift based on what we were talking about and what we've been talking about with the Europeans. We had kind of assumed that concession up to this point. But that was a noticeable shift, and if I had to guess, that would have been in response not to the Iran campaign, though it's possible. Russian strategic thinking is kind of a qualitative black box sometimes. But really in the suggestion by Zelensky of a trilateral summit, which Putin is absolutely determined to avoid, I suspect, in any form. So more to come.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. Asha, turning to you, I think over the years working in government, the conventional wisdom was always the Iranian regime would not use biological or chemical weapons or other kinds of sort of extreme weapons unless its back was against the wall and it was feeling truly threatened. I can't think of a position or a situation that would probably fit the bill more than right now. Wanted to get your insights on what we should be thinking about that, and also just the pure safety questions that could be at stake.
Yeah, so I completely agree. That has been what everybody has thought, that any country that might possess biological weapons could get a hold of biological weapons or could produce biological weapons. The wisdom was, well, they won't use them unless they have to, unless their backs are against the wall, unless they're desperate, or if militarily there's some reason to use that in response, some kind of counter response. You use nuclear, I'm going to use bio. You use chem, I'm going to use bio. I don't know that that was ever sufficiently justified. We don't know that for sure. I think it was just, I don't want to say it was hopeful thinking. I think it was just what everybody assumed. We have a tendency in the United States to think that, well, if we think that way, then everybody else thinks that way too. In this case, we do have to at least consider this as a possibility, but also they have 5 high-level laboratories, or at least 5 high-level laboratories in and around Tehran that are highly suspected of producing biological agents and producing biological weapons, or at least those agents for biological weapons. When all the bombing started, I don't know that the United States or Israel said, we're going to take those out. If you look at some of what we're seeing now, it looks like they did, but if it wasn't intentional, if it wasn't truly targeted, then we have a whole biosafety, biosecurity situation going on. What's being released from buildings that are partially down? HVAC systems are gone now. Are they moving things? Are they not moving things? What is happening? And if we consider the possibility of moving soldiers into these areas, military personnel into these areas, now we have a whole another thing. How are we protecting those soldiers? If we don't even know what was in those buildings in the first place, what are we giving them? No matter how you feel about vaccines, we're not going to give everybody 10,000 vaccines because we're just not sure what was there. There are other issues when we're talking about, are we long-term or short-term there? What we saw in Afghanistan was this concern. They could use bio. Something could happen. And then we took our Marines and we stuck them in overgarments for months, despite knowing that the filters inside would wear out after 2 weeks. They didn't get resupplied. They were really pissed off because they had to keep wearing these things in the middle of the desert in the heat. But that was the best we could do. Did we learn our lessons from that? And did any of those lessons, will any of those lessons be applied here? We don't know. That's all just sort of incidental to the question of intentional use. Are those biological weapons and biological agents separate from something weaponized? Are they in play now? And if they're not now, will they be in the future? How are we dealing with that? Or has U.S. policy and U.S. policymakers, have we decided that that's still too hard to deal with, so we're just going to put that over here somewhere and then deal with it later? If we decide to deal with it later, we still have to figure out how we're going to deal with it later. We've drawn down on the strategic national stockpile. We've drawn down on the defense stockpile, such as it is. We have exited WHO. How are we going to find out what's going on there without those assets, and how are we going to respond to what's going on there without those assets?
Thank you. Excellent insights there. Marcus, wanted to turn to how this conflict is impacting our allies in Asia. Joe mentioned some of the strategic considerations for Beijing as well. What are your thoughts there?
So I think the Allied views and the situation the Allies are facing really is different based on the economic challenges they're facing and the geopolitical picture as it affects their own interests. And so Australia, for example, doesn't seem to have a whole lot of direct negative effects blowing back from this on them right now. And also is very, so as a result, is very supportive of the U.S. operations And in contrast, I think what you see going on in Japan and South Korea is there's a lot of ambivalence because they're suffering some direct economic impacts right away. Significant loss in the South Korean stock market just reported because of their reliance on energy imports through the Straits of Hormuz. And so that's dominating, I think, a lot of the overall thinking about the geopolitical and economic risk each country is facing. But to drill a little deeper into particularly Japan and South Korea, because I think they're the ones that have the most potential to be affected by this, particularly in a security and military sense. There's good news and there's bad news. One aspect is looking at missile defense, and so there is a lot of awareness of the potential to have a magazine depth problem, as they say, to run out of interceptors. But on the other side of the equation, so far the performance of missile defense pretty impressive, reassuring to South Korea and Japan that both face significant missile threats both from China and from North Korea. But also another element of the good news is that there may be some solutions to the magazine depth problem that are already being shown in this conflict. One is, as you mentioned, the use of lasers. So directed energy weapons are a way to, you don't run out of interceptors. And that's something that, of course, has had a lot of interest, particularly in South Korea. But the other thing I found that was fascinating that hasn't gotten a whole lot of public play yet, but I'm sure it will soon, is that this was the first combat use of South Korean missile defense interceptors. And so there were actually some missile defense batteries being employed by the UAE to shoot down incoming Iranian missiles very successfully. And so this is something that can demonstrate the ability of allies without just license producing U.S. systems to actually contribute on the missile defense front. And according to the media reporting anyway, those interceptors cost about a third of their Patriot equivalents. So the news is not all bad on the missile defense front, but there is definitely concern about the capacity problem given the amount of missile capability threats that Japan and South Korea face. But then there's also this bigger picture, from what I'm hearing from the allies, from those in the region, about how this, on one hand, shows the U.S. Maybe getting to the point where it's overstretched, but on the other hand, it shows U.S. Military willingness to use force when called for, or the threshold for use of force. And so there are certainly some in South Korea in particular that are cheering this as an example of U.S. Willingness to take action, actually reinforcing their confidence in the event of, say, a North Korean attack on South Korea, that the U.S. would immediately be able to launch very effective, counterstrikes. But it's also counterbalanced by the realization, again, that the U.S. military only has so much capability to go around. But in general, the mood, I would say, is more focused right now on the economic implications than it is on the military implications.
Thank you. That's really useful. Jen, I wanted to go back to you. Quick questions for you on the Gulf. The Gulf states have prized security as kind of a basis for a lot of the way they project their power around the world. And now there are civilian targets being hit, there's a real danger for the public right now, at least at this stage in the conflict. And the Iranians have really gone after the Gulf states to the surprise of some with the intensity that they have gone after them. So love your thoughts there kind of about that Gulf perspective right now, where we are today.
Sure. Thanks, Tressa. I mean, you're absolutely right. For more than 20 years, for example, Dubai has really sought to project an image of stability, an oasis of calm and prosperity in a volatile region. Abu Dhabi, has emerged in recent years with the same, and Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 has kind of sought to capitalize on that trend and become itself a global hub. And so all of those, and not to disinclude Qatar in that, all of those Gulf states have a lot to lose in this conflict. Already, the images of passengers being stranded, of Qatar cutting off its LNG production. The visuals of this are terrible for a region, again, that has really sought to build its reputation on that stability. And so I think that, again, while there is no love lost, certainly between Saudi and Iran, but I think all of these states recognize the danger that this Iranian regime represents. They have long sought to balance that against a real fear of getting embroiled in a conflict that they now find themselves embroiled in. So this is a big hit for them. And I think that, they will be seeking on publicly to project a degree of normalcy. We're certainly seeing that out of Saudi Arabia. I think it's a little bit harder to do, frankly, in the UAE right now. But they will seek to return to some degree of normalcy as quickly as possible. Whether companies follow suit, whether this is a long-term hit on that reputation, I think still remains to be seen. I hope that the United States will continue the close partnership that it's shown under this administration and previous as well, to support them in that endeavor, having found themselves in a conflict that was surely not of their choosing. But I suspect that they will be trying to balance the same way that we are, the realities of the situation they find themselves in against, now that they find themselves there, a desire to make sure that this can't happen again. So I suspect those conversations are happening frequently and with intensity as they try to make sense of what the off-ramp may look like and how they can influence the Trump administration to wrap this up as quickly as possible, and in a way that ensures that there's not a repeat of it.
Thanks for that. Joe, I wanted to just touch on posture real quick. You kind of did earlier, but just to drill down on a little bit, within the region, within the traditional Middle East posture assumptions that we have, and then thinking globally, again, with your former DASD hat, what stands out to you most right now?
Well, there is a long-standing, decades-old conversation of how much posture we have in CENTCOM area and how do we begin to draw it down as we focus, certainly in the last decade, on the Indo-Pacific. And countless administrations now, including this one, have found they're pulled back into the Middle East. So I think there's a few implications here that we should watch out for as leading indicators. First is the open question of, will our Gulf allies and partners now come to the US and request additional security guarantees, additional US force posture? I think possibly rightfully stating we helped take part in this attack. They came back towards Iran. They're likely tacitly offering some level of support. And the US will then have to think at the opening of this administration, the idea was, we're going to do a little bit less in the Middle East. We're going to do more in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to do more in the Indo-Pacific. And now we're revisiting and post Operation Inherent Resolve, we had a long conversation of now maybe we can get out of Syria. Now maybe we can get out of Iraq. We can start to sort of downsize a little bit. All of those fundamental questions are going to have to be revisited right now, where now we might say completely the opposite. Now we're going to need a larger footprint there. We might have to expand our force protection at bases, especially if this is a melee that goes on in Iran now for years to come with random drone strikes here or there. So that's one. Second is there has been a conversation around might there be possibly reforms to the Unified Command Plan, and that is how we structure our combatant commands and our functional commands like Space Comm in the world. And I think now it's a big question mark of do we begin to make those sorts of changes when we're in the middle of this widespread active conflict? So seeing where we go with that, I think will be interesting. And then to the point that Marcus was making, I think allies and partners here might be thinking, okay, either what do we need more of the US, or is it actually a liability where now we have a target on our back if they take action that we're not entirely consulted with or aligned with?
Yeah, those are excellent questions and a lot more to be determined there. To remind the audience, both here and virtually, please be submitting your questions to askac.org. We're going to get to audience questions here in just a second. Andrew, I wanted to ask you about, Iran's sort of axis of resistance, its proxy networks have been greatly degraded. I think there's no question about that. But there's still important dynamics going on with traditional proxies. For instance, Hezbollah, I think, rightfully would be expected by Tehran to some degree to be involved in this response, given the history there. Doing so would not be definitely puts Hezbollah in a difficult position domestically from a Lebanon perspective, right? After all that's happened over the last few years. So talk about what the capacity is and the incentive, I suppose, for some of the traditional networks, whether it's in Iraq, Hamas, the Houthis, or even sort of less traditional groups such as, guns for hire, which Iran is absolutely known to do in far-flung countries. What's your thought about the state of that network right now?
Gosh, I think one of the most interesting things is that the proxy networks, the malign influence, really haven't been the story. For a long time when we war gamed Iran and we thought about a war with Iran, we thought that all of the proxy networks would make our lives in the region extremely dangerous. And they haven't. They haven't. Certainly, the Houthis have barely made a peep, but there was a statement that went out saying they were going to interdict, reclose the waterway through the Red Sea, and then that another Houthi immediately countermanded that. And they've been quiet. The Hezbollah has been kind of half-heartedly dragged into this war, despite it being domestically, as you noted, extremely unpopular. The Iraqis, who we thought was the main proxy threat, not just partially in terms of capability, but also because we just had a large amount of uniformed military servicemen in Iraq, often very close quarters with some of these Shia militia groups, have done almost nothing at all. In fact, the main response has been to take off the Hashed uniforms and basically march at the green zone, the diplomatic quarters, towards the U.S. embassy. There has really been no military action from them at all. Now, this is always taking your analytical reputation in your hands as you say this thing, because in the next 12 hours something different could happen. But I think it is true that this is much, 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 much less of a threat than we had thought. And I would suggest to you, particularly when you look at the quietest groups, the Houthis and the Iraqis, and this is not just me blowing smoke, but this is an element, this is downstream from the shock value and the deterrent value at the start of the war, because neither of these groups have really been militarily degraded. I mean, the Houthis had some losses in President Trump's campaign in February of last year, but nothing like a systemic operational degradation. And nor really has the economic piece, which was so central to the Trump administration's Iran policy in the first administration, really have been a primary focus. We really haven't heard a lot about the maximum pressure on Iran. Whereas last time, you had senior level officials, undersecretary and up, like personally making calls to ghost fleet vessels and threatening the captains of the ships and so forth. This is not happening now, right? We are not doing the weekly calls with the Treasury undersecretary about who we're sanctioning and kind of the threats to the face-to-face threats against the Europeans and Asians to stop buying Iranian products of any kind. So I think that really is. So there's not the economic pressure. There's not a military pressure, even though the Israelis have degraded Hezbollah quite a bit. So really, what you're left with is this kind of shock value of not wanting to be in the crosshairs, along with Khamenei and the rest of the IRGC, which honestly I think is a credit to the administration.
Thank you. Wanted to see if we have questions here in the audience. Gentleman there, please.
Good morning. Benjamin Marmon, I'm a master's student at the American University School of International Service. My question is about legitimacy of the regime. Basic political theory will tell us that the longer the regime remains intact, the more legitimized that they become after our initial intervention. So my question for you is, how do you see this playing out within the United States domestically if the regime doesn't in fact topple? And what implications are we going to see as impacts also increase on U.S. diplomatic sites abroad and the implications of that? Thank you.
Team, over to you. Were you able to hear that, Jen?
I heard parts of it, and I'm happy if you clarify the diplomatic piece of it. I'm happy to take that one.
Sure. Go ahead. Could you just clarify a little bit more of your question?
I just didn't hear a part of it.
No, all good. I was talking about with U.S. diplomatic sites being targeted, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and also the ripple effects as we've seen in Karachi. What are the implications of this?
Sure. I mean, the implications I think are obviously quite devastating for State Department and how we consider our presence overseas. But I would flip that around and take the opportunity to note that. First of all, we are always aware that those facilities are vulnerable. That is one of the reasons that the United States and its allies have long adhered to, laws of war and ensured protection of civilians. This is a very bad precedent on both sides that these have been so directly targeted. But it also, again, is an opportunity to speak to the fact that the protection of our official government people overseas seemingly was an afterthought to this operation. They were not removed from the region and from harm's way in the same way that they would have been in past conflicts. When you know that you have something coming down the pike that is going to put them in harm's way, then traditionally family members and non-essential personnel have been moved out. That didn't happen early enough in the process for our personnel to get flights out. And so they are much more vulnerable than they otherwise would have been.
Thank you. Other questions? Gentleman in the front.
In light of the attacks that have been launched against the Iraq oil field, some of the tankers and so forth, as Iran becomes more desperate, do you see them starting to ratchet up the attacks on the global oil infrastructure?
I'll take first crack at that. So, again, reading into the fog of war, I think, is always tricky. What I would say, though, is Iran's what seems to be indiscriminate launching of drones everywhere at once, at all of its Gulf allies, I think indicates some degree of breakdown of command and control. I think it represents some kind of a miscalculation. Perhaps there was a military rationale there where they believed by attacking all Gulf allies at once at the same time that therefore you would create this divide with the United States versus Qatar now launching military strikes against Iran, and I'm sure you'll see more of that. So I do think that you will likely see some degree of attacks on oil infrastructure, just like data centers, because I think they're in a little bit of a frantic moment right now. And just Secretary Hegseth and General Kane said we were going to get air support somewhat soon. If that is the case, and Iran really feels it's at risk of its launchers are going to be taken out and its drone factories, et cetera, you can see a scenario where they're going to throw all things at once out there as fast as possible, especially when all of its senior leadership was taken out on day one. So I was surprised to see not more of an attempt to mine the Strait of Hormuz. I think it might speak to capability or miscalculation. I thought that might have been one of the first things that they would do, but no, they decided to launch drones at Gulf allies instead, which is far more aggravating to them. So I do think that you are going to see random strikes, perhaps not this consistent pattern of behavior as they're launching all things everywhere at once, and you'll see some of that infrastructure get hit.
Thanks. Any other questions from the team here? If not, I wanted to turn to Marcus because I couldn't resist asking a question about North Korea. Marcus has had a great career analyzing that country. What do you think the North Koreans are thinking right now with the situation? What's most important to them?
Well, the North Koreans have for a very long time put forward the narrative that they need nuclear weapons to avoid being put in the situation that Iran's being put in. So I would say right now the North Koreans are simultaneously condemning what we're doing, but also making the case was this is why they need their nuclear weapons and patting themselves in the back for having developed them and fielded them. So, but I think they are well aware, though, of how this demonstrates the ability of the United States to reach out and strike, targets, overcome air defenses, and it, in some ways, Midnight Hammer was a real wake-up call, I think, for many in the region in Korea about the ability of the U.S. to project power. So we'll see how it, plays out in the coming days. But I'd say right now the North Koreans in general, and Kim Jong-un is happy that he's not in Tehran right now, and that from the North Korean perspective, they can deter the United States from doing something like this.
Asha, I wanted to ask you what the state of sort of the international conversation is about CBRNE, just in general, with Iran in mind. What is going on, if anything, kind of from the international safety response, and what aren't you seeing? Is maybe on the flip side of that with the situation right now.
Well, I think if we're looking globally, we have a lot of partners and a lot of non-partners paying attention. Obviously, everybody's paying attention. There are a lot of questions as to why there wasn't even the tiniest bit of advance notice for some things. France is wondering why they didn't get a little bit more notice so they could have pulled Doctors Without Borders out of harm's way. But then there's the flip side. Well, at least Doctors Without Borders are already in country, so maybe we can get some information. And this is not specific to bio, as you said. It's chem and bio and rad and nuclear and the explosive threat. So the international net of information is trying to turn itself on and get the information it needs. But it's having a lot of difficulty because there just wasn't a lot of notice, and everybody's trying to get in there now, after the fact. But the other side of this, it's a good question, asking what is North Korea thinking? What is South Korea thinking? What is everybody thinking? We've seen a number of attacks now on different countries by the United States. If this is going to be the new world order, then everybody's having to say, all right, well, if this is it, then we have to start resourcing things differently ourselves. How do we stay safe and how do we stay secure in this situation? It's not to say everybody's thinking, well, are we next? It's more to say, well, if my neighbor is next, then what happens with me? If he's going to get hit with biological weapons, then what do I need to stand up, not just for my own country, but for my interests elsewhere throughout the world? So that's one set of concerns. The other is everybody's on about the military stuff. The world understands what's going on. We've seen some recent reports about how long the United States or other allies can handle protracted military engagement. So there's a big question right now. We see this going on over here, there, and everywhere. What is China doing? How is Russia going to take advantage of this? Not necessarily, in terms of supporting Iran or whatever, but how are they going to take advantage? How are these two countries in particular going to take advantage of shifted focus and greatly shifted resources to a bunch of regions when they have their own things going on? This is the ideal time to start moving elsewhere, knowing that the United States and others are taken up with all of this stuff elsewhere in the world. But then again, it brings us back to what's the safety, what's the security a posture that everybody has to now somehow establish. Everybody is not just focused on the Middle East right now.
Thank you. Well, with that, I want to turn it over to Matt Koenig, who is Senior Director and Vice President here at the Council at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Matt, some closing remarks from you.
Well, thanks very much, Tressa, and what a fascinating and enlightening discussion covering the risks and the opportunities geopolitically of the war in Iran. And I just wanted to finish with one geostrategic opportunity that I see. As Will said correctly in his opening remarks, we are at an inflection point in history. And I've been arguing for years that the greatest threat the United States and its allies face, maybe in our histories, is this new axis of aggressors, China in particular, but increasingly working with Russia, Iran, and North Korea, collaborating more closely than Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Mussolini collaborated before World War II. And we all saw how much damage they caused. The National Defense Strategy correctly points out this risk of simultaneous conflict. So I think on the upside here, removing one of these pieces from the chessboard or significantly degrading Iran's capabilities for years, maybe even a decade, stands to transform for the better regional security, U.S. and global security. So I hope that the campaign is successful. And keep coming back to the Atlantic Council for our work in this area. It was terrific today to collaborate with Will Wexler and our Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East program. They'll actually be back here tomorrow for an event, the Iran War, Khomeini's death, and the future of the Middle East. So please tune into that. But for now, I'd just like to thank our distinguished panelists for their terrific insights. And also thanks to all of you for spending your morning with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon.